As the world marks the third anniversary of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, peace efforts are intensifying. US President Donald Trump has pledged to bring the conflict to an end, with high-level talks between the US and Russia now underway. However, the exclusion of Ukraine and Europe from these critical discussions has heightened concerns and escalated tensions. A recent fallout between Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, coupled with rumors of a potential deal involving a mineral agreement in exchange for aid, has left Ukrainian-American relations hanging in the balance. This week, marking the conflict's third anniversary, has become a diplomatically charged period. Top EU diplomats are visiting Ukraine. The UN General Assembly is preparing to vote on a significant resolution, and French President Emmanuel Macron has arrived in the US today. Later this week, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer will also travel to Washington, highlighting a week of intense global diplomatic activity. As Europe pledges to continue its support for Ukraine, questions are emerging about whether the continent can fill the void left by a potentially withdrawing United States. As the conflict moves into its fourth year, pressing questions remain. Can peace truly be achieved, and at what cost? Will Ukraine's exclusion from the talks undermine its position in the negotiations? And what does this mean for the future of the conflict? I'm Henny Saif, and let's go in depth. As the Russia-Ukraine conflict marks its third anniversary, leaders from Europe and Canada were in Ukraine's capital today to mark this event. As reported by the Washington Post, the anniversary was being marked as U.S. policies on Russia and Ukraine shift under President Donald Trump, while Putin's spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, said that Russia does not see any way to resume dialogue with Europe after the EU adopted its 16th round of sanctions against Russia on the third anniversary. The newspaper added that the EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas, on the other hand, insists that the US cannot seal any peace deal to end the war with Putin without Ukraine or Europe being involved. She is also expected to visit Washington on Tuesday for talks with the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio. As the Russia-Ukraine conflict enters its fourth year, peace talks between the US and Russia have intensified. However, Ukrainian officials remain sidelined from crucial discussions. Can peace be truly achieved, and how will Ukraine's absence affect the negotiations?
As the Russia-Ukraine conflict enters its fourth year, tensions remain high, with no immediate resolution in sight, despite calls for peace. Officials from Russia, Ukraine, and the United States continue to present conflicting narratives on how to end the conflict. Russian officials insist that any resolution must recognize Moscow's territorial claims, including annexed regions like Crimea and several oblasts in eastern and southern Ukraine. A Kremlin spokesperson stated that while Russia is open to dialogue, Ukraine must accept new realities on the ground. Ukraine's leadership reaffirmed its commitment to restoring its full sovereignty, stating that peace cannot come at the expense of its independence or borders. Zelensky has expressed outrage over Washington's apparent repositioning with regards to his country and flatly rejected U.S. propositions, causing unprecedented tensions in Ukraine-U.S. relations. The U.S., however, seemingly did not heed Ukraine's call, holding unilateral talks with Russia in Riyadh, excluding Ukraine and its European partners, raising fears that the Trump administration may be open to a hasty settlement of the conflict in Ukraine, favorable to Russia's terms. U.S. President Trump went further, trying to force Kyiv to sign a deal granting the U.S. exclusive rights to exploit Ukraine's rare earth minerals in exchange for future aid. This raises questions on whether Ukraine can survive the conflict with Russia if they lose U.S. military and economic support. Moscow, on the other hand, looks forward to normalizing relations with Washington, while aiming to negotiate a comprehensive deal with the US.
And for more analysis, we are joined from Kiev by Ambassador Yevgeny Mikitenko, the Ukrainian Foreign Minister advisor, and from Moscow, Ms. Olga Krasniak, the International Relations Professor. Thank you very much and welcome to In Depth. Your Excellency, I'll start off with you first. Now, on the third anniversary of the war, European Union top diplomats arrived in Kiev for a summit to discuss the strategy for possible negotiations and security guarantees. Now, what is expected from that summit, given the European concerns of being excluded from talks between Russia and the US? Can Europe fill the void left by the apparently retreating American support, Mr. Ambassador?
Upon you, I speak in Arabic, of course. We're guests here in Qnews from Cairo, Egypt, and certainly today, this morning, we have seen the arrival of diplomats to Kiev by train, because I would like to remind you, 3 years ago, all of the civil and military Ukrainian airport was shut down. So honestly, we forgot what it means to arrive by planes. But the biggest airport in Ukraine has been closed for 3 days now. So all of the heads of state from Europe, Ms. Larney, the director, the Director General, or the European Commissioner, and the Canadian Prime Minister, they're all arriving today to Ukraine by train, as usual. They will arrive at the Ukrainian parliament, where the reception was held.
Ms. Krasniak, now, with the third anniversary of the Russia-Ukraine war, now what's your assessment of Russia's position in the peace talks at this stage, especially with the
Well, we definitely see that Russia is very sustainable country, which definitely doing something what it wants and what it needs in order to provide its safety and security. We've been very sustainable in the previous years, and yes, now we are. I think it's the beginning of the peace talks. Definitely, all these diplomatic signs we are seeing right now, and we're talking about like two sides, the United States and Russia, sidelining European Union and Ukraine. And so it is understandable because neither European Union as entity nor Ukraine, they have sovereignty. And sovereignty means having and making their own decisions, independent decisions on foreign or domestic policy. And considering the fact that the sovereignty is very limited, it explains why just only the United States and Russia, they negotiate peace, and the following decisions will depend on the diplomatic negotiations and the talks between our two countries.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador Mikitenko, now both the US and Ukraine are presenting competing resolutions to the UN General Assembly for a vote today. Now, since there are no vetoes in the Assembly, Ukraine's resolution is backed by all 27 members of the European Union. It is almost certain to be adopted. What is the impact of that on the ongoing talks?
It is very difficult to expect what the result is going to be, but I would like to remind you that at the outset, more than 150 countries, members in the United Nations voted for Ukraine and against the Russian aggression. And now the Americans changed their stance, and I haven't yet read, and no one that read through the US proposals. They are not very clear, and we don't know the items, but we need to be patient and see what's going to happen.
Ms. Krasniak, Russia has emphasized the importance of the US-Russia talks for peace, and Lavrov praised the conversation he had with his American counterpart in Riyadh. Now, also, another round of talks will be held in Riyadh in 2 days. How do you view the role of these talks in achieving a resolution to the conflict?
Well, definitely those steps are very predictable from diplomatic perspective, because first we see diplomatic talks between representatives of foreign ministries or the state and the State Department. That would be a preparation step for the meeting between Trump and Putin, I believe. Maybe it will happen in the following days or maybe in a couple of weeks, so we will see. But the resolutions, definitely some consensus can be found and will be found. And what I think will happen, that the United States has already cut to supply Ukraine with weapons and money, and so they asking just to get something in return from Ukraine. So it means this military conflict from the Ukrainian side, backed by the United States, it's coming to an end. So definitely this military conflict, so something what is happening in the battlefield will be ending soon, I believe, and it would be for best for all of the parties involved. And then the negotiations will be on terms and conditions. And I believe Russia's interests are already considered by the United States regarding territorial gains, regarding Russian influence and Russian concerns about its safety and security. The main point is the United States is listening what Russia wants and what it needs.
Mm-hmm. Well, Your Excellency, how do you assess the impact of not having Ukrainian representation at the recent US-Russia peace talks in Riyadh? Or, I mean, do you see it as a setback for Ukraine's position in the negotiations?
According to my information, that wasn't expected for Ukraine to attend in the Riyadh negotiations. That was the first meeting for the representatives of Russia and the United States. But we will find new proposals. Why? Because Ukraine and Europe agreed 100% to Europe agreed 100% to stand by Ukraine in this war, in these unjustified war conditions. And we have seen the Security Council of the United Nations and the nuclear state against a non-nuclear state. But this is extremely strange in my opinion, because the first reason is that Russia announced that they will work on expanding and supporting against the NATO, and eventually by the end of this war, what did Russia obtain? They only increased and expanded their borders from the lands of the NATO members, at least 1,200 kilometers of lands, and this is I don't think this is a positive outcome for Russia, and I think that the Baltic Sea, which is extremely significant for Russia, is semi-frozen, and the movement there is impossible. The Russian either move with airplanes or military warships. Is that a positive outcome? Of course not. And secondly, I would like to remind you today that Ukrainian newspapers reported the last Russian casualties figures for 3 years of war, and no one is aware why Russia started this war. So imagine more than 100,000 killed and injured among the Russian military personnel.
Well, Ms. Krasniak, now, what would you say is a positive outcome for Russia? In the ongoing talks with the United States, you've mentioned that the US would listen to Russia. So what are the Russian priorities in negotiations and the concessions Russia might make?
Well, Russia's priorities are unchanged. It's about its safety and security. It's about NATO, or the impossibility or unacceptance of NATO enlargement through Ukraine. So definitely it will not happen. Plus, it is remaining territories for Russia. So almost like 20% of Ukrainian, former Ukrainian territories. So they're ours now. But it's important that it's our historical territory. It's not something we took from a different country. No, we just regained our own. So, and the third point may be lifting some sanctions for economic development, with mutual benefits between the United States and Russia. So security plus territory and plus sanctions, lifting sanctions. I think that would be the three main points are on the table for negotiations.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador Mikitenko, now, we are approaching the peace talks. Ukraine has emphasized its territorial integrity. So what are the chances of Ukraine making any territorial concessions for peace?
Undoubtedly, there will be concessions by Ukraine. And no one around the world, not even the United States, would acknowledge these concessions and these occupied territories by Russia. Russia, as they said and stated, they liberated Ukrainian lands, and who used to live there were Russians speaking the Russian and the Ukrainian languages. But if you even watch the movies produced by these liberated territories, and I quote the Russian statements, there is nothing there, only the remains of villages and the rubbles of factories and plants, the remains of cities, and no people. 99% of the Russian population left there ran away to Ukraine. Now the free zones to European neighboring countries. What is the outcome? What was the war for that started 3 years ago? This makes me recall Saddam Hussein. Do you remember Saddam Hussein in the 2nd of August 1990? Iraq stated that Kuwait is the 19th governorate of Iraq, and Iraq attacked Kuwait. What happened? We're all aware of what happened. This law of power, this law of jungle does not work. It sometimes does, but we can see here the outcome. We cannot see a just outcome from this.
Ms. Krasniak, now, there is a concern in Europe and Ukraine about a potential US-Russia deal sidelining Ukraine. How does Russia respond to these concerns about excluding Ukraine and Europe from direct talks?
Well, I do not believe we have any concerns about exclusion of Ukraine or European Union. Like I said, and I'm repeating myself, that neither European Union as an entity as Ukraine, they have sovereignty. So they depend on the United States. Ukraine depends completely, just absolutely. European Union is dependent on the United States on its foreign policy decision making. And of course, with the entities and countries who have limited sovereignty, I do not think Russia has something to talk about. In addition, that today it was announced another package of sanctions coming from European Union. So I do not believe we still have something to talk with European Union. And of course, Ukraine, it's not on the list either, because it has nothing, not just only to suggest, but it's totally a totally dependent state.
Your Excellency, now given the shifting dynamics in the US and Trump pushing for peace talks with Russia, his recent falling out with Zelensky, in addition to Zelensky saying he might sign mineral agreements with US in exchange for continued aid if he has to, how do you see Ukraine's relationship with the US evolving, and how would this relationship affect the peace prospects and negotiations?
Now, the United States proposed and provided this agreement to Ukraine. We worked on a draft and sent it to the United States. Now, the United States need to make a decision. We are optimistic, but however, we have talked to the US officials and we clarified that such agreement as they proposed will not be just or fair to Ukraine, and it won't be viable because we meant joint action in the East fields. There is a path that we can take. There are consultations and negotiations. I am cautiously optimistic regarding this.
Ms. Krasniak, now Trump has stated that Russia has the cards in peace talks due to the territorial gains, which puts Russia really in a strong position going into the negotiations. How does this statement align with Russia's overall peace strategy, and is there any Russian concern to anything that would jeopardize or weaken this?
Well, first, it's not just only territorial gains. It's also it's a Russian resistance of Russian economy to sanctions in the last 3 years. So Russia is not just only as seen itself, but actually represents a very strong power, very independent and economically independent and military independent great power. And President Trump, of course, he understands this. And for President Trump, of course, they have something more and something different to concern about. Maybe it's a competition with China, but getting back to the peace talks. Well, like I said, Russia is very consistent what it wants. And so what is important, it's not just only to negotiate the deal over the Ukraine, but basically it's about to think about the development, economic development of American-Russian relation. And I believe these peace talks, of course, they are about Ukraine, but beyond of this, it's about maybe new architecture of the world order and maybe new ways for economic development. So by now, Ukraine definitely can be seen as a burden for the United States, and they just get in a way of this burden. And more things are more important things to consider and to negotiate between the United States and Russia.
Well, Mr. Ambassador, Ukrainian President Zelensky has recently indicated that he might step down for peace if it ensures NATO membership for Ukraine. Also, Ukrainian parliament failed to pass a resolution backing Zelensky's legitimacy as president. Now, after 3 years of brutal conflict, what do you think the implications of that on Ukraine will be?
Now, we have a lot of prospects because Zelensky talked about this, but he also talked very sarcastically. It is very difficult or even impossible that with Ukraine and Russia we have a war front. We see daily conflicts and battles. 100 to 150 networks are on the distance of 1,200 kilometers. It's such a great distance, and we cannot expect what is going to happen tomorrow. We're still waiting to see. We are going to remain on our lands, and we in Kiev today, and there's a beautiful winter, and we have a lot of guests. And however, at night there was 150, 113 drones were targeted and shot. Life will continue, and we are optimistic, and we understand very well that we can coexist, but for this we need to fight for our lives and for our independence with all means possible, with our blood and work and tears, as said by British Prime Minister.
That was Ambassador Yevhen Mikitenko, the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Advisor, and Ms. Olga Krasniak, the International Relations Professor. Thank you very much for joining us here on the show. And as we conclude this episode, we will witness an intense week, marking 3 years since the Russia-Ukraine conflict began. The path to peace remains fraught with uncertainty. While diplomatic efforts intensify, the absence of Ukraine from key negotiations raises critical questions about its future in this process. With both the US and Russia pushing forward with talks and Europe maintaining its support for Ukraine, will these efforts lead to lasting peace, or will the situation continue to escalate? As the war approaches its 4th year, the stakes are higher than ever. I'm Henny Saif. Stay tuned, and thank you for joining us here on In Depth.